right under the guys, right under the feet that it was kosher. I even put on 17 extra, right onto the package. Right? So now I want to do tshuva. It's not possible. I want to do tshuva. How do you do tshuva? You do tshuva if I become the kind of person who finds the lost object of my friend and returns it to him. Those of us say, when you find a lost object, it's easy enough to pocket it. But if you become the kind of person who finds the lost object and returns the lost object, your cheskas kashrus is returned. Now, what does one thing have to do with the other? Shebazeh muchach shebevadei chazer bo mechemdas hamamon shahaisalo. Listen, this is so beautiful. So remember again, why does a person go ahead and sell trachas? Why does that happen? Why? Because I love money. Because I love money, but I love money in an unhealthy way. In an unhealthy way, right? Nothing wrong with liking money. Loving money is problematic. So now I'm selling trades because I love money. So now I lost my cheskes kashrus. How do I get that back? I get that back by restoring a proper relationship to money. How do I demonstrate that I've restored a proper relationship to money? I find your lost object. I can just as easily keep it and no one would ever know. But I don't. I give it back. And when I give it back, I thereby demonstrate that I have restored a proper relationship, a proper approach to money, to materialism. So I'll say, so the point that Tzadik is saying is, well, let's play this out. How does this happen? How does this happen? So Tzadik would say the way it happens is as follows. I sell the trachas, I'm pasala edus, I do my tshuva. There's multiple steps the person will list the tshuva. And then what happens? When my tshuva is complete and I'm ready, what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu do? What does HaKadosh Baruch Hu do with tshuva in general? He tests it. Because at the end of the day, not for God, but for me, the only way to really see that my tshuva is genuine is if it's battle tested. So what does he do for the Mocha Trefus? He goes out walking down the street, and what happens? I find Ruben's wallet. Ruben lost his wallet. No idea. No idea. He just in Baksha, Ruben just went to the ATM right beforehand. Right, said easy enough for me to have it out. But I don't. Ultimately, again, then my cheskes kashrus is restored. Then he goes on. He said, "We'll have to stop over here." He says, "Shebazemucha shebevadai chazubam machem dasalam shaisalo ukiyotze bazeh." He goes, "Shiyotzi trepa machmas yado b'zara chashuv mishlo ayin shay." So we'll say, so we'll have to stop over here. But again, the point that the Rebbe is making, and this is really incredibly profound, is this idea that while I am not permitted to put myself in the same situation in which I originally sinned, a person is not allowed to say, I'm ready to test my resolve. Let me put myself right back in the same circumstance in which I sinned. In fact, I remember again, part of the chiluk, part of tshuva is distancing yourself from the actions and from the circumstances which led to faith in the first place. Failure to do so is a fundamental lack of tshuva. But yet, the tshuva is only complete when it's actually tested. So how do I reconcile that? HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts me back in that matzav when He knows that I'm ready to handle it. And I'm able, He gives me the opportunity to show myself that my tshuva is complete and my tshuva is genuine. So I have to stop over here. We'll continue Yirtzeh Hashem one more shir in Os Ayin Gimel and Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow. All right, Joe, so good morning. Let us begin. So we are beginning this morning with Os to Shikhat Os Ayin Gimel. just sent out the PDF on the WhatsApp chat. But let's begin. So let's say a very beautiful, beautiful idea by the Rebbe. We're going to follow along in the Rebbe Hasidus. So on page Kuf Ayin Gimel, in the Rebbe Hasidus, the right-hand column. Adam Nitakin as Masha Chaka. When a person decides to fix, decides to rectify, decides to fix that with which he sinned, or in the way in which he sinned. Remember, so what the Rebbe is describing over here. First of all, it's the tshuva. Right, so what's interesting, by the way, that we're going to get into, in this particular audio, we're going to get into some of the dynamics of tshuva and what it means to be a valid tshuva. What it means to truly engage in the process of tshuva. We often translate tshuva as repentance, but the truth is the act of repenting is really only one part of tshuva. As many times before, the essence of tshuva, the Soloveitchik discusses this, tshuva and Joshua on tshuva, where he explains that the essence of tshuva is a first return. Teshuva comes from Lashon Shav, from Lashon Shuva, to return to our HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because the greatest byproduct of faith is the fact that I create a distance between myself and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the greatest byproduct, and therefore the essence of tshuva is the ability to somehow bridge that gap between myself and the Ribono Shel Olam. Therefore, the Rebbe says here something amazing. When a person wants to fix that which he sinned, or a person wants to fix that which he has broken in the process of sin, this is pretty wild. As Hashem Yisbarach, Nazmin lo nisayon kazeh ba'osepara. So the Baruch Hu creates a situation where essentially a person is placed in the same exact situation in which he sinned previously, and the Rebbe Rothschild puts me back in that situation to do what? To test my resolve and to give me the opportunity to this time make the right decision. So see how profound this is? So it says, I want to go ahead and I want to fix that which I have broken. I want to go ahead and fix that which I have made mistakes in. The Baruch Hu creates for me, summons up to me, and he's a test, a challenge, in the same way in which I previously sinned, puts me back into that situation. And he explains over here, Ba'osa Tekufo, Sheyitzer Gova Alav, Ba'osa Mako Misha Avraham Sabera. And what a Baruch will often do is literally recreate the same circumstances. And put me back in this same exact situation in which I sinned, in an effort to be able today, Shetia Chuvas Hamishka Vikach, Sheyiskaber Al Tavaso, Yukabshena, the Makom Shenichsha Boba Avam. And the Kodesh Baruch Hu goes ahead and allows me to engage in what he calls Chuvas Hamishka. Now this is a very interesting phrase. What does Chuvas Hamishka mean? So Mishka literally means what? Wait. So Baruch Hu allows me to engage, I guess, I don't know how the best way to say it. It's called a weighted tshuva. What's a weighted tshuva? So I'm saying, in the world of tshuva, there are different levels. There are different levels of tshuva. Even the Rambam discusses this. By the way, this idea that the Tzaddik is talking about is actually, if it sounds familiar, it's because the Rambam quotes in Hilchos Tshuva. The Rambam is not the one who created it. This is a Gemara Maseches Yuma. In fact, if you take a look, footnote, Reish Pei Aleph, all the way at the bottom, he writes over Kimavor B'Gemara, He'echi Dami Bal Tshuva. What's about Tshuva? Amra Yehuda Kigon Shebasa Liyado Dvar Avera Parmishona Ushniya. A person sinned with a particular Avera, one time, two times, and then what happens? The Nitzal Himena. And then ultimately, the third time, he doesn't commit the Avera. That's about Tshuva. And the Machir Ayudah says, by the way, when is that true? Ba'osi Isha, Ba'osi Perek, Ba'osi Makom. So the Gemara is illustrating this with a sin of immorality. So the Gemara says, what's Tshuva? I sinned with a particular woman one time, two times, I find myself in that same situation, right? Same situation, Osa Isha, same woman. Now, Osa Perek is something very interesting. The way the Rambam defines Osa Perek is I'm in the same stage of life. In other words, if I committed an Aveira, an act of immorality with a woman, and I did that. My walker with the tennis balls, and I have my little basket on the front, and little chair I can sit down on, and everything is great. And I say, you know what? I'm not going to sin with this woman. So I can't walk 3 steps, but Lamaisa. So the Gemara says Osa Perek means I have the same level of physical vigor and vitality. That's what it means. Same level of, because again, in all seriousness, to not sin decades later, is it now? Does it count for something? Absolutely. The Rambam says any time a person does tshuva, that act of tshuva counts for something, even if it's not quote unquote a perfect act of tshuva. Now, the Rambam, when he quotes this Gemara, he quotes a little bit differently. He says, "Eichi zami bal tshuva gama." That's the Rambam calls it. There's about tshuva, and there's about tshuva gama. It's about tshuva. What's about tshuva? It's about tshuva. Anyone who does tshuva, sincere tshuva, is about tshuva. And by the way, that's true even if a person does it moments before they pass away. So if you've ever seen it, one of the things I have been observed to see, and really it's supposed to see over the years, are people who do tshuva literally again moments before they die. If you with a person, the Shafi Tiesta Shoma is incredible space, and to see like a lot of times we go through life without clarity, and either we don't want clarity or we just can't find clarity. When a person realizes that they're leaving this world, everything becomes much clearer. And it happens. People do tshuva for all kinds of things in the moments before they leave the world. Is that meaningful? Of course. The Rambam says as long as you have breath, your tshuva is meaningful. But the Rambam also says that about tshuva gomer is literally one who sinned in a particular circumstance, then is placed in that same circumstance again, but this time does not sin. That's the highest level of tshuva. About tshuva Gemara, Osa Isha, Osa Makom, Osa Parak. The Rambam builds on this a little bit. So Tzaddik calls this something a little bit different. He calls this tshuva, this type of tshuva, of being placed in the same situation, all the same circumstances. The first time, second time I sinned. Now I'm back and I resist the temptation. What Tzaddik calls that tshuvas hamishkal. What's mishkal? Weight, right? There's a weighted tshuva. So it means the same thing, but it's just a fascinating term. Weighted tshuva means that this tshuva carries a greater weight. All tshuva is meaningful. All tshuva is important. But when I literally summon up the courage to abstain from sin, when placed in the same exact situation that I was in before, but this time I resist. This time I don't. I will say, by the way, it's interesting. The Gemara always, and the Ram does this also, always illustrates these cases with immorality, which is just fascinating. Gives you an interesting insight into the way Chazal view human nature. That's one of the greatest pushes and pulls and just like tugs, negative tugs that we have at us, ultimately again is immorality. So all of these cases, but again, I just want to point out, obviously you fill in with like, it could be with chaos, it could be with anger. I always get angry at a particular situation. I find myself now in the same situation, and this time I don't get angry. I resist the temptation. I pull back. I retreat. I don't get angry. That's Rabbi would call it about tshuva gomer, highest level of tshuva. But Tzaddik calls that tshuva hamishka, a weighted tshuva. That is a weighty. I have to think of a better terminology for it. That is a weighted tshuva. It's a heavier tshuva. It's a more substantive tshuva because literally faced with the same circumstances, but this time I didn't sin. Let's go back there a little bit. It says. כדי שתהיה תשובת המשקל בכך שיזכר also בקפשנו במקום שנכשל בו בעבר. So I'll say, even this Russian over here is so incredible. I overcome my desire, v'kapsheno. I capture it, I conquer it. Shehi hatshuva hamukaras. This is the most preferred form of tshuva, the highest form of tshuva. The mitzvah, so we'll say, so now, here, what's the problem with this? Now, if you would stop here, so a person might think for just a moment that what should you do? He said, well, let's see. The mitzvah ha'adam, she is daming lo hadavar min hashamayim. Shahari vada yesh divarim she'asra adam lahavias atzmo lideka. So let's say, there's an interesting dynamic over here. That in order for me to be about Shuvah Gomer, according to the Rambam, or to be about Shuvas HaMishkal, according to the Tzaddik, what do I need? I need the same circumstances. So Tzaddik says, hold on here for just a second. Because you might think, okay, no problem. Where is that situation that I sinned with? Now let me put myself back into that, because now I think that I am strong enough to resist that temptation. Says Tzaddik, no. We don't do that. A person does not place themselves in temptation's way at all. In fact, we say this in davening every single day. We ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to not bring us lowly daily sayon. Don't. So certainly, I'm asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu not to bring me alachas kama v'kama. I'm not allowed to put myself in a compromised position where I might sin. He says, you're not allowed to put yourself in a compromised situation like that. So we'll say, so Tzaddik says, if I sin with a particular woman, I am not permitted to go ahead and put myself back in that situation because I'll be over on Yichud. Now, of course, the Rashi to that is, Hanavai should just be Yichud, right? If it was just Yichud, I'm actually in pretty good shape. But Lamaisa, again, a human being is a human being. Rak Hashem, listen to us, this is incredible, this is. Rak Hashem Yisbarach Hu Mazmin Lo Davar Zeh. See, I will say, this is incredible. Tzaddik says that the way Tshuvas HaMishka works is that it is the Ribono Shel Olam who recreates the circumstances. Oshi is damin ezo inyan umatzikiyotzi bo biskabros yitzarachoka. So it says of Tzaddik, on one hand, Shuvas HaMishkal, the Rambam called Baal Tshuva Gemura, requires a recreation of the circumstances in which I sinned. On the other hand, I am not allowed to recreate those circumstances. Remember again, the great anomaly here is part of Tshuva is what? Azivas Achit. Not doing the thing which you sinned with. Right? In other words, leaving the sin. That's part of the dynamic of leaving the sin. So to place myself right back in that same circumstance is actually a violation of one of the tenets of tshuva. So I have this great tshuva paradox. I only fully actualize my tshuva when I resist the temptation to sin in the same situation in which I sinned before, but I'm not allowed to put myself back in that situation. In fact, it's a violation of my tshuva. It's a violation of my parole. It's a violation of my tshuva to put myself back into that situation. Says the Tzaddik, as the Baruch Hu does it. At the end of the day, Baruch Hu thinks that I'm ready, and he thinks that my resolve is strong enough, my willpower is strong enough, and my tshuva is sincere enough. Baruch Hu will create circumstances in which he puts me back in that very same situation. I can't do it, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu orchestrates that in order that it becomes the final step in my tshuva. That's right. We'll have to stop over here. Again, this is a fascinating dynamic. And Meretz Hashem will continue with it tomorrow. Yeah. All right, so say good morning. Let us begin. So we are picking up in Meretz Hashem in Tzidkas HaTzadik in Os Ayin Aleph. This is our third shear on this particular post, and we'll finish it today by way of review. We're picking up, if you're following on the handout that I sent out in the WhatsApp chat, we're on Daf Chuf Ayin in the Be'uriya Hasidus. We're going to begin in the bottom left-hand corner. So remember again, just to orient ourselves a little bit, the Tzaddik introduced this oath with the idea, first of all, of the concept of Yitamu Chatoim V'lo Yitamu Chotru. The idea being that people are good. People are good. But all too often, good people do bad things. So therefore, says the Rebbe, when we daven, we don't daven for the sinner to cease to exist. Rather, we daven for the sin to cease to exist. Again, he quoted the story by Bruya and Rabbi Meir. Okay, but then the Rebbe went on to explain this interesting idea that one is permitted to go ahead and daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to punish the individual who is Ra being Adam Lechavera. Right? Remember again, a person can have two levels of their persona, being Adam Lemakom and Adam Lechavera. A person who goes ahead and is Ra in his being Adam Lemakom. Ultimately, again, a person should not daven for such a person to be for such an individual to be punished. Rather, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like the Meir did, should daven for the person to do tshuva. But if a person is Ra Lebrios, if a person ultimately harms others, a person negatively impacts others, a person is compromised in their ben Adam Lechavero, then a person is permitted daven for that individual to be judged and punished by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Rebbe proved this point from the story with Elisha Hanavi, and also proved it from the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha. Interestingly enough, what we left off with on Friday was the bottom, as I mentioned before, the bottom of Chuf Ayin, in the Be'uriya Hasidus, left-hand column, last couple of lines. So the Rebbe said, however, in order to do this, in order to daven for someone who is Ra Lebrios, someone who is bad in his interpersonal conduct, to be judged and punished by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in order to do that, a person has to have a complete view, a complete understanding of who the individual is, i.e., Ruach HaKodesh. Elisha is Ruach HaKodesh. He could daven, but even right, Elisha, look, he saw nothing redeeming in these individuals. If you have Ruach HaKodesh, so you can go ahead and you can daven for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to go ahead and judge someone. Ru'ulam. Last couple of lines. Ru'ulam. Misha in about Ruach HaKodesh, but someone who does not possess Ruach HaKodesh, Yesh lo lakshosh v'li'manim me'ekayim. Such a person should refrain from cursing another individual. Al-at shemira lo sha'adam zeh ra'levios, u'muta lekalalo u'levat kishes ra'asto, shema afshar shanegia belibo, machmos shetzira adam zeh, ki ma'avarto, u'monaas mimenu lishmos karoi be'enei siflo, u'adam zeh achein ra'levios. So the Rebbe says something amazing. Remember, let's contextualize this a little bit. When we speak about the fact that I'm going to go ahead and daven for someone that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should judge an individual who is Ra Lebrios, right? This person is terrible in his interpersonal conduct. Who is he terrible to? The Pashtos, who is he terrible to? Me. It's me. That's what's happening over here, right? Even the example of Elisha. Someone wronged Elisha. Elisha ultimately brought punishment upon that individual. So the Pashto says the Rebbe, what we're talking about over here is someone really wrongs me. Objectively wrongs me. So we've now seen a concept where I am permitted to go ahead and daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the Ribono Shel Olam to punish this individual because of the negative behavior that he has engaged in that has negatively impacted me. Just as an aside, you see from this act, I'm sure I mentioned this last week, but it's kedai to repeat it. The whole episode over here is how seriously HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes our being Adam Lechavero behavior. That it is not just enough to be proficient in Adam Lemakom between yourself and God. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu really looks at how we interact and how we treat one another. So if I mistreat God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu can handle it. But I mistreat people, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to a certain degree the stakes are much higher when you hurt other human beings. Hurt other Jews. So the Rebbe says, something amazing. The problem, therefore again, in this model, I am permitted to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to the Ribono Shel Olam, to visit punishment upon the person who is not behaving appropriately in the Adam Mechavena. Says the Rebbe, unless you have Ruach HaKodesh, don't do it. Why? Because Lamaisa, how do you know that your intentions are really correct? Especially if you are the aggrieved party, especially if you are the victim, especially if you are the one who has been hurt. How do you know that you're really seeing things for what they are? How do you know that as a result of your pain, your entire perception of things may be colored? His Lashon is so profound. He says, Efshar shanigia na'avarto. Your negios, the fact that you are personally involved in this situation, na'avarto, blinds you. And who's to say you're really able to see this situation for what it is? We'll say, what an incredibly profound episode on a variety of levels. First of all, again, just sticking to the subject over here, whereas the Rebbe introduces a model in which it is permitted to daven for another Jew to be judged and even punished by HaKadosh Baruch Hu for his misdeeds in the realm of Ben Adam L'Chavero. The Rebbe says practically, only do it if you have Ruach HaKodesh. Why? Because when we are hurt by other people, our entire perception of reality vis-a-vis that person is skewed. Most of you all know this. You know, there are people with whom, we all have this, with whom you've had negative interactions. Right? People who just, they're nasty, they're mean, they've done something objectively that is just wrong. Every single time that person starts walking towards you, what happens? You tense up. And every single thing that person says, right, is heard through a certain filter. That's the way life works. Right? You go ahead and you perceive people based on the reality of past circumstances. Says the Rebbe, can you really, if you've had a negative interaction with someone, can you ever really look at another interaction impartially? Can you really ever be objective? Can you really ever see things for what they are? Or does your pain color every single thing? And therefore says the Rebbe, although it is true that this situation of davening for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to judge someone does actually exist, doing it in the absence of Ruach HaKodesh and explicit clarity, you see a situation for what it is, don't do it. The Rebbe goes on, he says, H. Kafayin Aleph, we'll do this piece and we'll stop for today. The Rebbe says, Ume'achar shetzarach lahotzi milibo hanegios, kodem shegomer b'daito, shura lebrios u'muta l'kallo. So therefore says the Rebbe, because a person has to go ahead and remove any negios. Negios means like any, I guess we'll call it like conflict of interest, right? I have to remove any conflict of interest from my heart. I have to make sure that I'm able to see things for what they really are. Before, number one, I judge someone to be Ra Lebrios, and number two, curse them. He says the Kaf, David Amalek Alav Shalom Ba'osa Mizmar, Hamuv Le'el, Amr Alatzma Al Safosik, the Libi Chalal Bikirbi. See, I will say, here's what's interesting. Another example of cursing people who are Ra Lebrios, who behave negatively, another example of that is David Amalek. You know, in Sefer Tehillim, there are examples of David Hamelech cursing his enemies. And his enemies are not non-Jews. His enemies are members of Klal Yisrael. So how is David able to go ahead and curse other people? So again, that's the Rebbe's model. When someone is Ra Lebrios, when someone behaves in a way that hurts other people, you are permitted to go ahead and ask that HaKadosh to intervene, to judge, and even to curse that person. But David says, before I did that, what happened? The Libi Chalo Bikirbi, which literally means my heart was hollow inside of me. What does that mean? He says that. Goes to Yerushalmi, Shahargo David Hamelech Yitzhahara. Hard to even understand what this means. David Hamelech slaughtered his Yitzhahara. Right? David Hamelech came to a point in life where he was able to totally overcome his Yitzhahara. Perish Kavanato, Ayush Amar David, Shemuto lo lekelel esono, מפני שאין לו לחוש לשום נגיעה, שמא הוא עוסק in the Tavas Asmo. So you see David HaMelech, before he judges another person, and certainly before curses another person, what happens? He says, Ribono Shalom, I've shafted my Yitzhara. I've shafted my Yitzhara. Because that's the level that a person has to be on prior to going ahead and judging and cursing another individual, even for what may be objectively the most egregious behavior. So let's say if we bring this all together, with this we'll stop for today, but if you bring this all together, the Rebbe really developed an incredible model, which highlights a number of lessons, even though what the Rebbe is suggesting in actuality is not Lamaisa, as the Rebbe himself explains. So number one, I will say we see that at the end of the day, how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks at someone who's Ra Labrios, someone who is compromised in their Bein Adam Lechavero. The Ribono Shel Olam could go ahead and handle a lot if I'm not good in my Bein Adam Lemakom. But the moment I begin to mistreat individuals, the moment I begin to trample upon the dignity of another Jew, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says opens me up to Klala. And in fact, says the Rebbe, if I see someone who is Ra Labrios, I have the right to go ahead and daven for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to curse such an individual. So lesson number one, how seriously we have to take our Ben Adam L'Chavera, and how seriously we have to take how we treat our fellow Jews. And even things that may not seem so significant to us, if it tramples the dignity, tramples the feeling of another, to go ahead and abstain. Lesson number two, says the Rebbe, but don't curse unless you know that you are seeing things for what they are, and you have objectively true clarity. Meaning what? It says that either you have Ruach HaKodesh, or you've slaughtered the Yitzhara. So either if you have no Yitzhara or Ruach HaKodesh, then you can stand in judgment of another. But if I don't possess either of those things, which Patash goes most of us don't, right? Just understand, you rarely see things for what they are, and your view of reality is often skewed, especially if the person in question has visited harm upon you. Another incredibly important lesson, how when we are hurt, or we are involved in a situation which results in pain, how difficult it is to be able to see things for what they are and to recognize that often our judgment of the situation and our judgment of others is so fundamentally skewed. And therefore, says the Rebbe, if I know that because of my pain, because of the hurt, I'm not seeing things objectively, I'm not seeing things for what they are, I have to be so careful to abstain from judgment and certainly from cursing the other. All right, well, so we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up in Yom Hashem tomorrow in Ayin days. Shkayach, everyone. Sorry? It's very true. It's very true, right? That even more so he was the king. Yeah, he did. Absolutely. All right, Javosai. Good morning. Let us begin. Let us begin. Okay, we are picking up in Yom Hashem this morning in Tzidkas HaTzadik, and we began yesterday Osh Ayin Aleph, section 71, and the Rebbe introduced this idea that even if one sees that another individual is a Rasha, one should not chas v'shalom go ahead and curse that individual. However, or wish evil upon that individual. But interestingly enough, the Rebbe said that halacha l'maisa, person should never go ahead and ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu for something negative to befall another person, another Jew, even if that other Jew is in fact a Rasha. The Rebbe qualified that statement and said that applies when the individual in question is a Rasha in terms of his bein Adam L'Makom. Means there is a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But if the person is in fact Chas v'Shalom a Rasha, bein Adam L'Chavero, in his interpersonal conduct, then the Tzaddik actually says that it is mutter to go ahead and daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to see something terrible befall this individual, so that he should stop with his rishus. He should stop with his evil that he is engaging with towards his fellow. Now, what's the logic of that? So we kind of do this piece quickly. I'm on page Kuf Samach Tes. Page Kuf Samach Tes in the Orei Hasidus, left-hand side, the end of the first paragraph. And then this is about Adam Shura Lebrios. When a person who is evil in his bein Adam L'Chavero truly mistreats and hurts other people, he says, Ansho Mida Kineged Mida. His punishment is reciprocal. Mida Kineged Mida. How so? Same way that this person is focused on doing something negative to his fellows, in that same midah, it is mutter to go ahead and ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to go ahead and punish him for his evil. So in other words, the midah keneged midah is this person who is ra in his bein Adam L'Chavero, this person who is negative in his interpersonal conduct and hurts other people. It is mutter to say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, please visit hurt, please visit ra on this person, because that's midah keneged midah. That's reciprocal. So I'll say it's a very I don't know what I read this. It's a very shocking piece, only because to see any piece of Hasidus which actively speaks about going ahead and seeking out harm for another individual. And we understand the person in question over here is a person who's causing damage, is a person who's causing hurt, is a person who's causing harm to another person. But first of all, in general, we don't daven for people to get punished for sin. We daven for the divine system of justice. Like Mashinim al Sihi Sikra, Chalarisha Kerega Soved. That's a supplication to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Run the world with justice. Run the world with justice. But it's fascinating here that our Tzaddik is teaching us you can't daven for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to punish a person who's Ra Bein Adam L'Makom. You can daven for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to punish a person who's Ra in his Bein Adam L'Chavero. Okay, so I want to show you. See, he brings a couple of examples, but I'll show you something fascinating. Turn the page to Kuf Ayin. So on the right-hand column of the Orei Hasidus, the left writes as follows, the bottom right. He says, listen to this. And this is incredible. Well, I'm skipping this, and I want to do it today. Matzinu Batorah Shashem Yisbarach Amar Abraham. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Avram Avinu, where? Parshas Lech Lecha. He says, U'Mekalelecha Ha'or. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says in the opening of Parshas Lech Lecha, Hashem says to Avram, those who curse you will be cursed. Dainu, she'ani mekalel elo she'in mekalel elo rak esni she'mekalel oscha hiura lebrios. So it's interesting. Why does HaKadosh Baruch Hu say to Avram, those who curse you, I will curse? So the Tzaddik says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is like Avram, anyone who curses you is a ra lebrios, is bad to people. Right? Is ra, is a rasha. Interpersonal conduct. So if someone is wrong in his interpersonal conduct, then ultimately again I will curse him. So if Tzaddik looks at this as a paradigm, you see that almost is just permitted to go ahead and wish for Ra upon those who are terrible in their bein Adam L'Chavero. So if you curse Aaron Avinu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says such a person will be punished, because that's what happens. See what comes out, interestingly enough, is you see that if I'm Ra in my being Adam Lamachom, like if I'm evil or I'm bad in my relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's a threshold for that. There's a threshold. Because Baruch Hu is forgiving. If you're wrong with Rios, if you're bad to people, there's much less divine forgiveness for that. Which makes sense because it's easy to understand why I can violate the word of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I don't see him, right? I don't always perceive him, and I can't necessarily always relate to him. But human beings are right in front of you. How can you hurt another human being? How can you mistreat another human being? How can you trample over another person? So as much as I can't intervene and ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to go ahead and visit Ra upon a person who's Ra L'Shamayim, whose badness been out of the Makom, I am permitted to go ahead and intervene and ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to visit punishment upon someone who is Ra in his bin Adam L'Chavero. And again, the Tzaddik ultimately using Avraham Avinu as the example of this. However, in the left-hand column page, Kofai, I'm going to do this a little bit of, we'll start this piece today, we won't get to finish it. The Tzaddik now comes along and qualifies this idea, and he says, V'yafal pi shemot lekalav ulevakish esras mishura lebrios. Even though the Tzaddik said, I have explained that it is permitted to actively beseech Hashem to visit Ra upon a person who is bad in his bin Adam L'Chavero. It is permitted. So this is be very careful. Be very careful about whether or not you do this. Kevan shekam b'davar zeh matzinu b'sofa hamaysim ha'aretz ve'elisha hanavi ne'enash al zeh shekilo osem v'shalach hazal b'sofa v'shalach shekol machmor zeh. So interestingly enough, one of the examples that the Tzaddik brings for this is the story of Elisha Hanavi. That Elisha went to a particular city and had bitter waters. He cured the waters, and then there were a group of boys. The Gemara says it wasn't boys, it was men, young men, who were just very disrespectful to Elisha. And he cursed them. A bear comes out, goes in and kills them. So the Tzaddik uses this as an example of being able to go ahead and ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to visit Ra upon people who are compromised, the people who are bad in the way of the Mechavero. So the Tzaddik says, be careful of it, because even Elisha was stricken with illness as a result of having been the cause of the punishment for these young men. And aside from the fact, what the Tzaddik is saying is, at the end of the day, a person has to think long and hard whether or not they want to be the cause of someone else's punishment. In other words, I might have a right to have him to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to say, Baruch Ruvain is so terrible and he's been Adam L'Chavero, please punish him because look how much misfortune he has brought upon others. I might have a license to do so, but whether or not I should do so is a whole other matter entirely. Elisha had the license to do so also, but yet it came with incredible repercussions. Not only that, listen to this. There's another reason why you should be careful about cursing a person. He calls it cursing, but davening that a person should go ahead and be punished for their misdeeds. Listen to this. Shows that this is so profound. Kilo l'chol adam choto l'kalo af mishura l'brios. Shari amru chazal be'elisha vayiru shira she'im ba machlukas v'ulam. So I'm just skipping a little bit. Mi she'ino bal ruach hakodesh yesh lo lachshosh u'lehimana milakamna. See, I will say, I probably should have done the example inside. The paradigmatic example of this that Tzaddik uses is Elisha. Right? So Elisha goes ahead and he goes to the city, he sweetens the bitter waters. These young men act very disrespectfully to him. And it wasn't just the fact that they were poging in his cupboard. These guys were bad guys. They were bad guys. They were bad guys to the residents of the city. They were just bad guys in general. So the pasuk says, this is incredible. Vayifen acharov vayarein. He looked behind them and he saw Vayikalam, and they cursed them. So Tzaddik over here quotes from the Maharsha, who says that before Elisha cursed them that they should die, he looked into their souls. Was there any element of good contained inside of them? And if there was some element of good or some future good that would come out, he would have abstained. So Tzaddik says, what do you see from here? Before you curse another Jew, you have to really be able to see them in their totality. You have to really be able to see the whole person. Or in other words, you have to have Ruach HaKodesh. A little thing called Ruach HaKodesh. If you have Ruach HaKodesh and you could see a person through and through, if you have Ruach HaKodesh and you could sum up the totality of an individual, if you have Ruach HaKodesh and you could see what a person is, where they came from, and what they will be, and it still looks like Rishus, then Rav Tzaddik says you could curse. Then you could curse. But in the absence of the ability to have that Ruach HaKodesh, says Rav Tzaddik, never daven for the misfortune of another individual, no matter how much pain they may be causing. And we'll have to stop over here for today, but this is an incredibly important episode. And we see ultimately where we're going to go with this, which is this serves as the basis for how careful we have to be in terms of passing judgment about others. Because often all we see is what is in front of us. All we see, and sometimes, by the way, sometimes people objectively act in terrible ways. And sometimes objectively they just cause terrible pain, and they're wrong. Not everything is being down the kapskos. I mean, yes, should always be down the kapskos, but sometimes even after you're down the kapskos, people do bad things, and people do wrong things, objectively wrong things. But how I react to that, and if somebody says, what I'm going to go ahead and daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to do to that person, be careful. Because at the end of the day, very often, all you know and all you see is the person who's standing in front of you. But you don't see that in their totality. So Tzaddik now is going to go back and say, even in Elisha, who serves as an example of davening for a person who is Ra Lebrios, had Ruach HaKodesh. Be careful what you daven for the individual. Be careful, the judgment you pass upon the individual without having the ability to see that individual in their totality. We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up, we'll spend one more day in Eretz Hashem on Monday on Ayin Aleph. We'll stop over here for today. Go on.
Worst podcast ever. There it comes. Here's hilarious. It's
all right,
so
we'll
white.
say good morning.
So
Let us begin. So this morning, in Eretz Hashem, we are beginning Os Ayin Aleph in Tzidkas HaTzadik. I sent it out yesterday on the WhatsApp chat. And we're going to get over here a really beautiful and incredible idea. If you notice, by the way, sometimes these sections of Rav Tzaddik flow into each other, sometimes they don't. So in Os Ayin, we were dealing with an incredibly profound idea that from destruction comes incredible building, and from sin comes cathartic growth. In Ayin Aleph, the Rebbe switches gears a little bit, and he writes as follows. We're taking up mark page Samach Tes, Os Ayin Aleph, and we're going in the Uriach Hasidus, the bottom right hand column. Says the Rebbe, in his Balal Ulovakish Me'ashem Yisbarach, Liros Ra'as Shum Adam Yisrael. Person should never daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to see the Ra, to see something terrible happen to another Jew. A person shouldn't daven to see something terrible happen to another Jew. Gahiru Rasha Gava, even if that other Jew is a complete Rasha. Kimosha Amnu Chazal, as Chazal said, Alakosot Yitamu Chatam in Haaretz, Yitamu Chotim in Ksiv Babasa. So let's take a step back over here. So we'll discuss where Tzaddik gets this from. So the notion that even if someone is a Rasha, one should not daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for some misfortune, for something negative to occur to that person. Now, where does this concept come from? If you take a look in the Cole's to the footnotes, on the bottom, you'll see footnote Reach Samith Gimel. Right? In footnote Reach Samith Gimel, he writes as follows: the Gemara Brachos Sham is to this story. Hano Baryone, the Havi Bishvihu say Rabbi Meir. There were these Baryonim. Baryonim are ruffians, right? No goodniks. Right? There were these no goodniks that were in the neighborhood of Rabbi Meir. Bahava Kamitsaru Leituva. And these guys were causing Rabbi Meir an incredible amount of difficulty. Havakabai Rabbi Meir Rachami Elihu, Dilahechi Dilemusi. Rabbi Meir wanted to daven that they should die. This is the Ma'aseh. We saw some brachas. He wanted to daven that they should die. They were causing him so much tsar, they should die. Amalei Beria the Visu, Beria, his wife, said to him, "My Dave, what are you thinking? In other words, why would you daven for them to die? Mishum d'chsev yitamu chatoim, miksiv chotim, chatoim ksiv." So listen to this. Beria had such an incredible deal, such an incredible insight on the pasuk. She said, "Does the pasuk say yitamu chotim min haaretz, that sinners should cease to exist in the world?" No. What does it say? Yitamu chatoim, sin should cease to exist from the world. Not sinners, but sin. Vov, Shafal is safe for the crop. Furthermore, she said to Rabbi Meir, look at the end of the pasuk. Or the pasuk say, "Urishaim od einam," and the wicked will be no longer. So how do you read that pasuk? Kevan di tamu chatoim urishaim od einam. Once you remove the sin, there are no more sinners. What Beria was telling her husband, let's finish. Rather, Rabbi Beria said to her husband, daven for them, daven for their benefit, daven for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to have compassion on them. Then they hajru b'tshuva, there's the tshuva, or the sha'im odeam, and they will no longer be wicked. Sure enough, boi racham iluya b'hajru b'tshuva. Rabbi Meir davened on behalf of these Rishayim. They did tshuva and they became tzaddikim, or at least I don't know if they became tzaddikim, but they did tshuva. They did tshuva. So the story is fascinating for two primary reasons. Number one, what Beria was saying to Rabbi Meir is that essentially there aren't bad people; there are just good Jews who do bad things. And a person sometimes has to be able, when they look at the other, to be able to differentiate this idea. Very often, we automatically assume that we characterize the character of someone based on their actions. If you do something bad, that means you are a bad person. And what Beria was trying to highlight was this incredible yesod. That's not necessarily the case. Are there bad people? Of course there are bad people. But very often there are good people who do bad things. And if you're just able to stop the bad things, to remove the bad things, the inner good ultimately comes out. So instead of davening, says Beria to her husband, for these guys to die, daven that they should do tshuva. And if they do tshuva, yitamu chatoim min haaretz, let sin cease from the world. And if there's no sin, urishaim od einam, there will be no rishayim. The person, the gavra, is good. Just sometimes the gavra corrupts himself with the wrong actions. If you correct the actions, the gavra, the individual, is restored to his primary good. I will say, what Beria was telling Rabbi Meir was essentially this concept is the cornerstone of tshuva, right? Without this, bad. If I'm bad, so is there really some significant degree of hope for my salvation or personal restoration? This entire yesod, I'm a good person who does bad things. I may do bad things very frequently. That's quite possible. I may even do more bad things than good things. But at the end of the day, my inner good still exists on some level. It's just often eclipsed and tarnished by the negativity. Remove the negativity, remove the sin, and at the end of the day, the good comes out. As an aside, by the way, I'm sure you remember, when we did this sugya in brachos, there's another famous kasha on this sugya, which is, how do you daven for people to do tshuva? Right? Meaning, at the end of the day, the Gemara says, "Hakol b'dei shamayim," except what? Chutz yira shamayim. Yira shamayim is your relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, relationship with Hashem. At the end of the day, is up to you. It's up to you, right? The Gemara Masechet Nida says, Kadosh Baruch Hu determines how tall or how short you're going to be, how rich or how poor, how smart or not smart you're going to be. All of that Kadosh Baruch Hu determines. One thing the Rothschild does not determine is what the nature of your Yiras Shamayim is going to be. Who you are on a Yiras Shamayim level is absolutely up to you. So it is interesting that over here the Gemara is interesting. So you would normally think you can't daven for someone to be a Baal Tshuva. You can't daven for someone to be a Baal Tshuva. So they'll say, so there's a lot of different answers to this. It always bothered me a little bit, and then I realized the answer was in yesterday's daf. This is incredible how this intersect often happens. The answer was in yesterday's daf. Remember again? We saw the Gemara said, "Ha'omer Sela Zulat Staka B'Shvil Sheyichye B'ni." Let this Sela go for tzedakah in order that my son should live. And remember again, we saw the beautiful insight by the Chozeh of Lublin. And what did the Chozeh say? You remember again, the Chozeh said that what's the pshat? It's not talking about physical life, but rather it's talking about spiritual life. That at the end of the day, a person could give tzedakah, do ma'asim tovim, in order that their child should spiritually live. That's the whole yisod. That's the whole yisod. Right? So you see that there's a concept of engaging in dynamic spiritual activity for the benefit of someone else. So perhaps that's the yisod over here as well. At the end of the day, can you daven for someone else to do tshuva? So you could daven that your zechuyos should in Hashem push someone else, push their merit in the right direction. The same way that I could daven for the ruchnius, and I'm obligated to daven for the ruchnius, do mitzvahs for the ruchnius of my children each and every day. So too, again, perhaps that's the pshat in the Gemara. How do you influence someone else's ruchnius when ruchnius is the one thing that's in a person's own control? So perhaps again, when I daven and I do mitzvos and I direct those zechuyos for the benefit of the other, then ultimately that has a cathartic effect on that person as well. They'll say that has not to do with something so. If something's so going back, we have another thing. We'll just focus on this. Go back up now top to Yoreh Hasidus. So the Rebbe writes. He says, therefore, a person should never daven that something terrible should happen to another Jew. Even if this Jew is a Russia Gamer. That's an incredible use of it. You see why this is. You should never daven for misfortune to befall another person, even another Jew, even if that Jew is a Russia Gamer. And now, the Rebbe quotes the Gemara Masechus Brachos, where again, Rabbi Meir wanted to daven for the misfortune of these individuals. Ruya intervened and said, don't do it. Why? Yitamu chatoim below yitamu chotim. So we'll say, listen to this, then we'll stop. So this is interesting because why not? Why not? If somebody is a Russia, right? If somebody is a Russia and somebody's evil, so why can't you daven for their misfortune? In other words, what's so look what he writes. First of all, the Rebbe qualifies it. He says, "V'zeu klal hanoig rak ba'adam shura l'shamayim v'chotei v'vein adam l'makom bilvad." When can't you daven for the misfortune of someone? When ultimately, again, they are an individual who is Rala Shamayim, a person who is terrible and has been Adam Lamakom, a person who's a Rasha, Mamish, violates every single mitzvah, tramples upon halacha. Such a person, a Rasha like that, you don't daven for his misfortune. Let's say, listen to these words. Aval Adam Shehura Lebrios. So Rav Tzaddik says you can never daven for the misfortune of another Jew, even if he's a Rasha. And a Rasha meaning what? Even if he's terrible and he's been Adam Lamakom, you see that he tramples on mitzvahs, tramples on Torah, tramples on halacha. But if a person is terrible and he's been Adam Lachavero, if a person is terrible and is interpersonal, that mistreats people, hurts people, then ultimately says that tzaddik, ansho mida kineged mida. Such a person like that receives a punishment that is mida kineged mida, reciprocal. ולכן, כשם שמבקש שיהיה רלו זולסו, בעושה המידה יענש בכך שמותר לבקש ולהספלל להשם שיענש על העשו גם. And ultimately, again, says the Tzaddik, there's a midah k'neged midah. Because when a person is terrible and is being adam l'chavero, and therefore he actively seeks out negativity towards the other, so ultimately I am permitted to go ahead and beseech HaKadosh Baruch Hu to visit negativity upon that person as well. So I will say, we're going to stop over here for today. We're leading off in a little bit of an uncomfortable spot, right? Because the notion of davening for the misfortune of any Jew seems to be a little bit counter to how we would think to act as people. But yet, Rabbi Tzaddik is making this profound distinction. We never daven for the misfortune of a Rasha if he's a bin Adam l'makom Rasha. But if someone is a bin Adam l'chavero Rasha, says Rabbi Tzaddik, it is permitted to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to visit justice, so to speak, upon that individual. Why? How? The deeper meaning of that, the Meretz Hashem will continue to know.
Well, glad to have you here. We can leave the thing started. Yeah. Oh, yes. Wait a second. What is it? Oh, well, absolutely. But in the meanwhile, to stand in for you, while they use the restroom, we are going to bring out the Iron Patriot, everybody. First ever. Our first ever homosexual head of security. Wow. Justin Martindale, a.k.a. Iron Patriot. How you doing today, buddy? Wow, this is amazing. Right, exactly. Glad that you were able to be our backup head of security today. A lot of people weren't able to do that. I had to call out. This is podcasting kryptonite. Yeah, it's really. I'm sure it is. It's really hard. Got it right there. Last time you had this trouble with the mic.
All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. So we are starting this morning in Tzikas Tzadik. We are picking up in Os Ayin, and we left off on page Samich. So we're going to just reorient ourselves a little bit. Tzadik is speaking about this incredible idea, namely that the area in life in which we experience profound deficiency is often the area of life in which we could find the greatest amount of strength. So, Tzaddik essentially is teaching us the idea that our weaknesses really highlight or show us what our potential strengths truly are. So, Tzaddik gave a couple of examples of this. Today, we're going to focus on one incredible example. So, if we're on page Samefes, the right-hand column in the Uriah Hasidus, first paragraph on the top, about 4 lines in. Ta'al derech zeh, gam ki matzin, asher amru chachamim yizal. You also find what Chazal said, V'nayot shebiyom shenechra bo habayis. The day on which the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, bo bayom nolad Malach Mashiach. On the day on which the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the Malach Mashiach was born. The Gemara says, Tzaddik says, Hare, Shish Skula Shadavka Bismana Kinkul, Yivali Batikuna. I'll tell you something amazing. Really? This idea, we've all heard of this idea. That on the day that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, Mashiach was born. So it's Yerushalmi. He quotes it over here in paragraph Reish Nun Hey. It's actually a very beautiful Gemara. Let's take a look at it together. Yerushalmi. Of the Hava Bachad Yehudai, the Hava Koim Radei. There was a particular Jew who was plowing with his ox. What happened? Ga'as Torsei Kumai. The ox, he let out a groan, whatever the groan of an ox is. Right? The ox let out a groan. Avar Chad Argoy, Shamakala, there's an Arab who was passing by. He heard the ox making this sound. Amalei Bar Yudoi, Shari Turecha, Shari Kankanecha, Harid Beis Mikdasha. Jew, go ahead and unhitch your ox and unhitch the plow because the Beis Hamikdash, your temple, has been destroyed. The Arab was saying to the Jew, there's no point in doing anything. Your Beis Hamikdash has been destroyed. Gas Zman Tzisa. So then the ox rolled a second time. Amalei Bar Yudoi, Chater Turecha v'Katar Kadkanecha. Said, Jew, whatever the Al-Sim will say, resaddle or reattach your ox to the plow. The Hayalid Mount the Mashiach. For your Mashiach was just born. This is the source for this idea. So right, on one moment, the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, and in the very next moment, Mashiach is born. Amalei Mashmei, so the Jew asks the Arab, what is the name of Mashiach? To which the Arab responded, Amalei Mashmei Menachem. Ultimately, what's the name of Mashiach? What's the name of this Mashiach? His name is Menachem. Amalei Mashma Dabri. What's the name of Menachem, Mashiach's father? Amalei Chizkiah. It's a very, the Gemara itself is a very gripping story. The Gemara then goes on to discuss how this particular Jew tried to do anything and everything in order to be able to find the Mashiach. The point of the story is that in the very moment that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the Mashiach was born. Why? Because this is the Tzadik's thesis that from killing, from destruction, whether it's personal destruction or whether it's national destruction, in that destruction are the very seeds, are the very catalyst for dynamic, cathartic growth. So on a personal level, it's often because when we, as we mentioned already the last 2 days, when we sin and when we make mistakes and when we destroy ourselves, we begin to see what our weaknesses are. And when we see what our weaknesses are, now I know what I can work on. It's very important. Think about this a little bit. People rarely improve when life is going well. Right? Usually, again, when everything is firing on all cylinders and everything's doing what it's supposed to do, people generally don't change. People change when things go horribly wrong. People change when they hit a brick wall. People change when they make mistakes. That's how change in life truly works. And that's what the topic is saying over here also. When is Mashiach born? Mashiach is born when the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed. When do Adam and Chava begin their redemption? When they're covered with the fig leaves, the very thing with which they sin. When do we begin to make dramatic changes in life? When we make mistakes and I realize, you know what, I'm pretty broken, or I'm broken in this area, or I'm deficient over here, and now I know exactly what it is that I have to fix. So Tzaddik goes on, he says, this is so beautiful. So the Gemara Masechet Sanhedrin discusses the idea. From where do we know that there's a concept of Tchias HaMesim, resurrection of the dead? Where do I know that concept exists? And Rav Tzaddik goes on and he says, the Gemara brings a number of different proofs. So Rav Tzaddik then goes on to say something so beautiful. He says, what is the concept of Tchias HaMesim? Think about this for just a moment. And this is such an interesting insight. What's Tchias HaMesim? Down on the most basic level, something that is dead comes back to life. Why is Tchias HaMesim the paradigmatic example of what it is that occurs over the course of the Messianic era? Right? What is that? What is that? And Rav Tzaddik says something so beautiful. Tchias HaMesim is the paradigmatic example of the ability to take something that is broken and to go ahead and once again make it whole. Isn't that and that's why, what's the emotional Mashiach? What is Mashiach all about? Mashiach is all about repairing the world. Mashiach is all about going ahead and repairing ourselves. We have to repair ourselves before Mashiach comes, right? Once Mashiach comes, often that opportunity is lost. But the Ma'aseh Tzaddik says, the fact we have a concept of Tchias HaMesim tells you that no matter how badly something is broken, it can be repaired. Isn't that incredible? See, each and every day in Mishmar Esrei, right? We speak about if I believe in Mashiach, if I believe in Tchias HaMesim, if I believe that the dead could come back to life, then no matter what is broken inside of me, can be fixed as well. He goes on, he says, take a look in the left-hand paragraph on page Kuf Samachas. V'zeu inyan hara aduma. Again, the Tzaddik just goes on and he's just giving a number of examples like this, but the reason why it's kedai to go through the examples, even though they're all highlighting the same point, is because it is interesting to see how reinforced this concept is within our tradition. That you see example after example, situation after situation, where over and over again you see the notion that from that which is broken emerges that which is whole. From the mistakes we made, we learn how to build. From that which is dead, has the ability to come back to life. He gives one last thing I'm going to stop for today. He says, "B'zeu inyan paraduma." This is being in a paraduma. What does paraduma have the ability to do? Paraduma has the ability